What's up guys, and welcome to this week's video. And today we'll be looking at frame rates. We'll be diving into how they work and how I use them to create cinematic video, as well as some of the issues you might run into when mixing frame rates together. Now let's get to it. Frame rates come in a variety of different flavors. For this video, we're going to keep it simple and focus on the ones that should be inside of your camera. Frame rates per second, as FPS or P, is how many images your camera takes per second, puts it together to create perceivable motion. How many images we squeeze in per second, and by changing the speed of the video, that gives us very different visual effects. To start us off, 24 frames per second. That's what we know is standard for film and movies, and gives us realistic motion. You can speed up 24p footage and get just fast speed motion, but if you slow it down, you could get some choppy footage because there's not enough frames in order to create slow motion if you stretch out the clip. There is some exclusions to this, like using optical flow in Twixtor, but general rule of thumb is 24p is good for regular motion, regular video, like talking head. Alright, that brings us to 30 frames per second, which is pretty much the standard for news and TV, which sometimes has faster moving subjects and requires less cinematic motion blur. Now 30 frames a second can be slowed down. Now if you slow down 30p footage to a 24p timeline, which is about 80% normal speed, so you get a little smoother footage while still maintaining that nice flow. You can use this to change the pace in your video or even stretch things out a little bit. Now to get into more cinematic looking motion, that buttery smooth slow motion that we all want, we get to 60 frames per second, which means we're taking 60 images per second. And this is like the standard to what we see on slow motion. It gives a cinematic buttery smooth motion. It's about 40% of normal speed. This gives us buttery smooth motion while still maintaining a good amount of movement in your frame. This also lets your pace continue, so it's not completely slow, but it's definitely slower than normal speed. And what 60p can do is it really gives you cinematic movements, but it also gives you a little bit of emotion in your video. You want to make sure you have quite a bit of motion in your video while you're recording 60p if you're going to slow it down to 24p, because if you don't, it'll look like a static shot. There won't be a lot of movement, there's not a lot to slow down, so it may even look like nothing's moving at all. Last but not least, 120p, 120 frames per second. This is one of my favorites. This adds 120 frames per second, which you have a lot more room to play with, and you can slow your video down quite a bit. The only caveat to 120p is a lot of times you can't record 4K or high resolution footage while in this mode. You definitely want to make sure you have fast moving subjects inside the frame, otherwise it will look like a static shot or very slow. And this is about 20% normal speed, so it's quite a bit slower. This will also remove a lot of camera shake and errors in camera holding. Because it's so slow, it smooths out those shakes. Some cameras have the ability to interpret footage in camera. What this will do is this will allow you to record at 120p, and then the camera will automatically put it at a 24p timeline. One of the benefits of this is the fact that you can actually see your footage on camera without having to bring it into post first to look at it and see what it looks like in slow motion. You want to record your footage at the intended rate. So if you're trying to do slow motion, you want to record in slow motion. You want to record in 60 or 120 or even 30. One of the benefits of recording at 24p or 30p is that you can keep your shutter speed lower too. I would record at 120p all the time, and I wasn't getting full 4K footage first off. Secondly, my video, you could tell that it was just, shot at 120p and it was sped up at different times. It just didn't look right. So I always say shoot for what was intended. If you're not exactly sure, shoot for 30 or 60, somewhere in between. I did speak about motion blur a little bit earlier, and this is important because we want to make sure that what we're seeing in camera, especially if it's supposed to be somewhat realistic, that it's believable. And sometimes this will push us out of that cinematic value if we don't have nice motion blur. There's a basic idea, the 180-degree shutter rule. You want to keep your shutter about double what your frame rate is. So if you want to look like your motion is actually moving the way it should be moving, you want to create realistic motion blur. So if I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, I want my shutter speed to be about 1/50th of a second. So you want to ensure that your exposure is correct. So by either changing your ISO or your aperture, and in some cases, if you're using 24 frames per second and you have your shutter speed down to 50, you may use an ND filter or something to keep that shutter speed in your aperture where you want it to be, especially if you're trying to get that shallow depth of field. This rule, like any other rule, can be broken, of course, as a stylistic preference. If you want that crisp detail with very little motion blur, like battle scenes or fighting scenes where things are moving so quickly and you want it to be less blurry, one tip I can give you too is to create different things with your camera. Try different settings out. If you want to shoot at a certain shutter speed and slow it down or speed it up, play with it. That's how a lot of people learn. It's one of those things where you can see the differences and really see what benefits you. And once you get to know your gear, then you just have to worry about the creative process, which is the fun part of this. They can completely change the look of your footage and the emotion that you get out of it. You know, we're just aiming for cinematic value, but really sometimes you don't need cinematic value. Slow motion doesn't necessarily have to be cinematic, but it does give you that added emotion to your clip. Thank you for watching, and if you like this video, please subscribe, and tell me which frame rate you prefer down in the comment section below. And for more tech, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.